New tonight, there are calls for an investigation into South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham after his phone call with Georgia's Secretary of State. Secretary Brad Raffensperger says Senator Graham called him in November before Georgia's election was certified. The Washington Post reports Senator Graham, who leads the Judiciary Committee, asked if it was possible to throw out all absentee ballots in counties where there was a high rate of mismatched signatures. Senator Graham later denied that, said they simply talked about how to verify signatures. Now a former U.S. attorney based in Georgia is asking the state elections board to see if the call violated state law. In a letter, attorney Michael Moore writes, "I am particularly concerned that the chairman of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee would make any attempt to interfere with the Georgia Secretary of State as he endeavored to lawfully perform his constitutional duties in overseeing the 2020 election and the counting and recounting of the votes cast in the state of Georgia."